History doesn't disappear when you erase a face. It waits until someone finally asks why it was changed.
She was described in her own trial record as short, dark, and wearing her black hair cropped like a man. That's not my interpretation. That's not a Hotep theory from a YouTube comment section that is sitting in the official transcript of the 1431 Inquisition trial that burned her at the stake. And somehow, some way, every single painting, every statue, every movie, every church window depicting Joan of Arc for the last 600 years shows a pale, rosy-cheeked white girl from the French countryside. Somebody looked at those trial records describing a short, dark woman and said, yeah, let's go ahead and paint her blonde anyway. Tonight, we're finding out who made that call and why it mattered so much to them that they kept making it for 6 centuries straight. Let's start with what we actually know about how she looked, because the historical record on Joan's physical appearance is thinner than most people realize, and what little exists keeps getting glossed over. The trial transcripts from 1431, the condemnation trial where the English-backed Burgundian court had her burned, describe her in passing. Short, sturdy build, black hair. That's it. No blue eyes mentioned, no fair skin mentioned, no rosy complexion. Nothing that maps onto the porcelain French maiden that gets stamped on every Notre Dame souvenir. The one contemporary sketch of Joan that historians consider the closest thing to a portrait was drawn by a court clerk named Clement de Fauconberg in May 1429. And here's the kicker: he never saw her. He drew it from secondhand description while sitting in Paris while she was fighting in Orleans. So the earliest image of her wasn't even based on her face. It was based on somebody else's words about a woman they may or may not have seen clearly in the middle of a military campaign. Every image of Joan of Arc ever made is working from a broken chain of custody. The original description said dark and black-haired, and somewhere in the relay race between 1431 and 1920, when the Vatican finally canonized her, that description got quietly swapped out. Now let's look at Dormy, the village in northeastern France, where Joan was supposedly born around 1412. Most people hear French village and picture rolling vineyards and white faces and baguettes. But medieval France was not the racially homogeneous place the history books would have you imagine. This was a country that had been at war, trade, and intimate contact with the Moorish world for centuries. The Moors, black and mixed-race Muslim people from North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, had controlled large parts of Spain from 711 AD. At their peak, Moorish territory pushed directly into southern France. The Battle of Tours in 732 is often taught as the moment Charles Martel stopped the Muslim advance into France. But that battle happening at all tells you the Moors were already deep into French territory for years before it. And battles don't mean instant borders. People don't vanish after military defeats. The Moorish population that had been living, trading, farming, and intermarrying across southern France didn't evaporate in 732. They stayed. They blended. Their children and grandchildren became part of the French population that history later retroactively described as simply French, simply white, simply European. Because by the time anyone was writing the national story, it was politically convenient to forget the complexity underneath it. The 100 Years' War, which is the exact conflict Joan stepped into in 1429, had also been moving armies of diverse composition across France for nearly a century by the time she showed up. Those armies included soldiers from North Africa, from the Iberian Peninsula, from the Eastern Mediterranean. They left people behind. They left children behind. Domremy specifically sat in the Meuse Valley in Lorraine, a border region that had been disputed, occupied, and repopulated multiple times over by forces from multiple directions. When Joan was born there around 1412, she was born into a frontier community on the edge of wartime France, not a pristine monocultural village. The assumption that everyone in Dormy in 1412 looked like a modern stock photo of a French person is a projection backwards from a national mythology that didn't even exist in that form until hundreds of years later. France, as a white Christian monoculture, is a story France told itself after the fact. In 1412, the story was still being written, and the people in it were considerably more mixed than the final draft admitted. She wore men's clothing. Constantly, consistently, from the moment she stepped into the military until the moment they killed her. And her refusal to stop wearing it was one of the central charges at her trial. The inquisitors came back to this over and over, because under medieval church law, a woman wearing men's clothing was considered an abomination. Joan's response across multiple interrogation sessions was essentially that God told her to wear it and she wasn't going to stop. Now here's what nobody asked. Men's clothing in 1429 was not loose or ambiguous. Armor is fitted. Tunics are fitted. Hose are fitted. If Joan was living, sleeping, eating, training, and fighting alongside hundreds of soldiers for months at a time, and none of those soldiers raised an alarm about a woman among them until she was captured, what does that tell you about how she moved through those spaces? What does it tell you about how she presented? The trial records note that her captors made much of her clothing as evidence of heresy, but they struggled to make the gender inversion the automatic shock they needed it to be, because the soldiers who fought with her for months apparently had not found her presence jarring enough to revolt against it. A pale, delicate, obviously female peasant girl would have struggled to pass in that environment. A person of ambiguous presentation, short, dark, cropped hair, compact build, might have moved through it differently. The voices she heard, which she identified as divine guidance from Saints Catherine and Margaret, deserve a closer look, because both of these saints have histories that the Western Church quietly minimized over the centuries. Saint Catherine of Alexandria is one of the most fascinating erasures in Christian history. The Catholic Church removed her from the official Roman calendar of saints in 1969, saying there was insufficient evidence she existed as described. But Catherine of Alexandria was an African saint. Her whole story is set in Alexandria, Egypt. The historical tradition around her is North African. Early depictions of her, like early depictions of many Egyptian saints, showed a dark-complexioned woman before the European Renaissance painters got hold of her image and began the same reclassification project we've seen with every other black figure in Christian history. Saint Margaret of Antioch had a similar trajectory. also removed from the Roman calendar in 1969, also associated with the Eastern and African Christian tradition before her Western rebranding. Joan of Arc, at her trial, insisted these were the voices guiding her. The English inquisitors pushing for her execution called those voices demonic, partly because they represented a spiritual authority that bypassed the institutional European church entirely. A French peasant claiming direct communication with African saints whose orthodoxy Rome itself later decided to question, that's not a small detail. That's the kind of spiritual genealogy that had to be managed carefully by the people writing the history afterward. How did she do what she did? Think about the logistics for a second. Joan of Arc, at approximately 17 years old, walked into the court of the uncrowned French king, Charles VII, convinced him in a private meeting to give her command of a military relief force, received that command, led it to Orleans in 9 days, broke a siege that the best French military commanders had been unable to break for months, won a series of subsequent engagements, and then personally escorted Charles from Reims for his coronation. In medieval France, where class determined your entire life trajectory before you opened your mouth, where a peasant woman had essentially zero pathway into a royal court, let alone a military command, Joan not only got in those rooms, but convinced the people in them repeatedly. She convinced the garrison commander at Vaucouleurs to provide her an escort. She convinced the court at Chinon that she was worth a private audience with the king. She convinced the king himself in what all accounts describe as a brief, private conversation. She convinced military commanders to follow her. None of that is the trajectory of someone with zero cultural capital, zero presence, zero authority that preceded her. Peasant girls in 1429 France did not move like that. They didn't get those audiences. They didn't get those commands. The historical explanations for how she pulled it off tend to fall back on charisma and divine favor, which are ways of saying we actually can't fully account for this within the normal rules of how medieval French society operated. Her trial in 1431 was one of the most nakedly political prosecutions in medieval European history, and historians across the board acknowledge this. The court was run by Pierre Cochon, the Bishop of Beauvais, who was openly in the pocket of the Anglo-Burgundian faction that had captured Joan and wanted her dead. The English needed her execution because her entire military career had been a catastrophe for their campaign to control France. But they couldn't just kill a prisoner of war. They needed to discredit her, which meant they needed to prove her divine guidance was actually demonic. And to do that, they needed a church trial. The 70 charges they brought against her included witchcraft, heresy, wearing men's clothing, consorting with evil spirits, and apostasy. They interrogated her for months. She was 19 years old, in chains, no legal representation, no advocate, facing trained inquisitors and theologians who questioned her for hours at a stretch. She held her own across those interrogations to a degree that genuinely unsettled her captors. The transcripts show moments where the interrogators had to redirect or rephrase questions because her answers weren't giving them what they needed. Eventually, she signed a confession, probably without fully understanding what she was signing since she was illiterate. Then she recanted the confession. Then they burned her. Immediately after burning her, the executioner reportedly raked back the coals so the crowd could see that her body had been completely incinerated, leaving nothing for anyone to collect as a relic. They didn't want a grave, they didn't want relics, they didn't want any physical remainder of her that could be venerated, which means they were still afraid of her as a body even after she was dead. 20 years after they burned her, a rehabilitation trial organized by Charles VII cleared her name entirely, found the 1431 trial corrupt and invalid, and declared her a martyr. Think about that sequencing. The French king who owed his crown to her, who made zero attempt to rescue her during her captivity, who stood by while the English burned her, then waited 20 years until the political wind shifted and commissioned a new trial that made her a hero again. The Rehabilitation trial of 1456 interviewed dozens of people who had known Joan, and those testimonies are where a lot of the biographical detail about her actually comes from. But here's the catch. By 1456, Joan had been dead for 25 years. The people testifying were testifying about memories a quarter century old. They were also testifying in a political context where the desired outcome was already decided. The French crown needed a saint, not an ambiguous figure whose origins and identity raised uncomfortable questions. So the testimony got shaped toward the narrative Charles VII needed. The complexity got smooth, and the story that emerged from that smoothing is the one you were taught in school. By the 19th century, Joan of Arc had been fully nationalized by France as the defining symbol of French identity. This is when the real image problem kicked in. The Third Republic, the French government struggling to hold the country together after losing the Franco-Prussian War and fighting off internal political chaos, needed a unifying national icon that transcended political factions. Joan was perfect. She was Catholic enough for the conservatives. She was the people's champion for the Republicans. She had fought foreign invaders, which was exactly what France needed to feel good about after being humiliated by Prussia. In 1909, she was beatified. In 1920, she was canonized. And throughout this entire nationalization process, the version of Joan that got codified was emphatically, aggressively, unmistakably white, because a black or mixed race Joan could not serve as the symbol of French white national identity. A woman whose trial records described her as short and dark-haired could not become the pale, golden warrior maiden of French nationalism if the people building that myth let the original description stand unchallenged. So they didn't challenge it, they just painted over it, repeatedly in every medium available to them. The paintings are where the lie is most visible if you know how to look. The earliest surviving visual representations of Joan from the mid-1400s are rough, schematic, and notably dark in their color treatment of her. As you move through the centuries, the paintings get progressively lighter. By the 1700s, she's pale, but still looks like she might be Mediterranean. By the 1800s, the nationalist paintings are producing a woman who could be from Scandinavia, golden-haired, blue-eyed, luminous in white armor. Jules Boston Lepage's famous 1879 painting, the one that defined the visual template for modern Joan iconography, shows a light-skinned, auburn-haired country girl with a beatific expression. That painting was made 448 years after Joan died by someone who had never seen her, working from no verified visual source in a period when France was using Joan as a nationalist rallying symbol. It's not a portrait, it's a political poster. And every movie, every church window, every Christmas ornament, every greeting card that came after it was working from that painting's template rather than from any actual historical evidence about what Joan looked like. The image compounded itself forward until the painting became the reality and the actual trial record description. Short, dark, black hair became the thing people needed to be told. So here's where all of it lands. There is no verified portrait of Joan of Arc made during her lifetime from direct observation. The earliest description of her physical appearance says short, dark, black hair. The village she came from sat in a medieval France that had significant black and mixed race populations from centuries of Moorish presence and military movement that history retroactively whitewashed. She moved through military and royal spaces with a natural authority that the normal class rules of medieval France cannot fully explain. She claimed spiritual guidance from African saints that the church itself later decided were too historically inconvenient to keep on the calendar. She was burned so completely that no physical evidence of her body survived. And then her image was rebuilt from scratch over 6 centuries by people who needed her to be white for reasons that had nothing to do with history and everything to do with power. You want to know what's actually radical about Joan of Arc? It's not that she was a girl who fought in a war. It's that the real her, the short, dark, black-haired woman in those trial records, has been so thoroughly replaced by a painted fiction that most people would argue with you about her appearance before they'd ever go read the primary source themselves. The receipts are there. They have always been there, sitting in the trial transcript, waiting on you to stop looking at the painting and start reading the record.